So anybody that knows me or has been keeping an eye on our business over the years will know that I just love fishing rods. As much as we sell other things, it's the rods that I've kind of really come to love, enjoy trying to understand, fishing with lots and lots and lots of different types, seeing the differences between the brands, how they make their things, and trying to get to think ahead really in a way as to perhaps what the next trend will be, or just more specifically from my own point of view, trying to imagine how I might be able to apply a certain style of fishing rod to a certain situation, even if that's something that's not commonly done at the moment. Just trying to look ahead all the time really, and I really enjoy that about rods and how they are now changing. The fact that anglers are trying to move forward, which is great, means that we're now within our bass fishing, for example, looking at wider ranges of rods in terms of weight and casting, length, all the different variables are kind of coming together now, so that far from now being bass fishing, for example, just being more about length and casting power, it's now become far more than that. And it's a topic that needs talking about because it can sound really complex, but it's just a case of trying to, as with anything, apply in a way certain aspects to your own fishing depending on what you do and how you do it, and to a certain extent what you like as well, just as an individual. Because the one thing that I should put out there straight away is that there's no right or wrong with fishing rods. I mean, you can just, people will just come into the shop, and I do the same. You just pick up a rod and you just feel like it's the one. It doesn't matter whether it's technically designed for what you want to do with it. A lot of fishing rods is just what you like, and it's been always the case in our shop actually. If you've come in, I've never been a salesman, I don't claim to be a salesman, but I just enjoy these products. And if you come into the shop, it'll be very much a case of me, rather than just trying to sell you a rod because I want to sell it to you, very often it's always been a case of me offering you 3 or 4 options that I know are all going to do exactly what you want to do. It's then just down to you as the individual to actually choose which one you like and which one you go home with. So I can help with that online. It's obviously easier in the flesh, but I can certainly help with that through phone calls, emails and whatever else. But like I say, we'll get into it because it's a big topic potentially, and something that I'm kind of looking forward to sharing a little bit of. So our bass rods typically, most of what we sell is Japanese, which kind of makes it a bit easier to sort of summarize to a certain extent. Most of the Japanese brands historically, you'd get sea bass rods, which are maybe what they describe as regular action, let's say. So meaning of that, I mean actions, to get briefly into that, you'll go anything from a slow action, which is sort of very parabolic, all the way through to a very, very fast action, which will be super, super tippy. It doesn't necessarily mean that that very fast action rod is super stiff, but technically, when you measure the taper of it, you'd find that it goes from initially very thin at the tip and quite quickly thickens up. So the faster the rod is, the quicker it's tapering out basically. So that's going to give you a more tippy action. There's contradictions to everything, as I say, but just I'll try and keep this as general as I can. But with our bass fishing now growing and becoming more versatile with the types of fishing we're starting to do, within our estuaries especially, where we're fishing very light, we have, I would say, generally 4 types of rod that we might consider using. They do now that we're looking at the likes of the Japanese bream rods and also the rockfish rods that they use as well. Not to be confused with LRF, these are the proper sort of RAS type rockfish rods. Bream rods, rockfish rods, sea bass rods, they're all different in the way that they are designed and also in the action of them as well. So again, just to talk initially about the tips of those styles, you might find that bream rods, for example, can be very, very fast. There are, within bream rods themselves, you will get solid tips, like on the likes of our Tailwalk B Breamer SSD. You have this initial section up here, which actually is solid. The point of that is to actually, it's not soft, it's not floppy, given some solid tips are, but this isn't. And this is designed for sort of maximum feeling through the rod. So when you're bouncing a lure on the bottom, you've got this solid tip here, which is going to kind of bring back everything to your guides, and it's through your lines contact with the guides that you're eventually going to feel that what's going on through the reel seat. So a solid tip gives you 2 things potentially. One of them is when it's a stiffer solid tip, as these are, it gives you more bottom contact. With potentially the other end of the scale, if you had a lighter solid tip, that might mean that, like just a lighter tip generally, which we'll talk about in a minute, that can give you a little bit better casting with a very light lure. It also is going to have its negatives though, because as with every style of rod, I mean, the more you know about them perhaps and the more experienced you are, the more you'll appreciate that there really are different rods for different jobs if you want to get to the sort of nth degree on everything. So these B Breamer rods and bream rods in general, this is a little bit of a unique one because of this solid tip. But this is going to be an amazing rod for us for the likes of our creature baits and things like that, and just light lures generally around the estuary. The nice thing about the Breamers is that they have a lot of power given their ratings actually. So ratings are something that we will talk about with these styles of rods generally, but They are rated to sort of 18, 20 grams, that sort of ballpark. I'm not going to go with exact figures on this video, but it means we have a lightweight rod, very sensitive in the tip, perfect for bottom contact, combined with lots of power in the butt. So great for our bass fishing if you are sort of pottering around the estuaries and the creeks and just wanting something that you know you can fish, especially a plastic on. But they are versatile enough that with light lures generally you can fish them, but it's at the other end of the scale, obviously, that we'd look if you were fishing bigger or heavier lures, or if you were being more aggressive with the way you were twitching them. So we'll jump initially actually straight to the other end. And this is the Japanese rockfish rod. So this is a graphite leader Tyro, brand new into us at the moment. Very, very crisp and steely, which is very much what a lot of people like these days in their bass rods in particular. Steely is a word we throw around all over the place. Really, for me, it kind of just basically means very light, but very crisp. And they can feel quite stiff, in fairness. And it's a good feature to have. Again, like anything, there's negatives, but it's a lovely rod to hold. When we show people rods in the shop, very often they just want the steely one because it's just kind of the way that we've all come to judge our wiggle tests, in that they want them to be light, they want them to be steely. It's a great thing for certain lures, and again, we're not saying that it's not good for certain things, because most rods you could fish nearly anything on them really if you wanted to. It's just they're not necessarily going to be 10 out of 10 for everything. The steely rods, even though this isn't necessarily designed for it being a rockfish rod, it's this type of action that is going to be great for a topwater lure, for example, for some people, because it's got that stiffness in the tip, and because actually with rockfish rods what you get over a sea bass rod, the difference there's two differences really that I kind of see it as. One, initially with a rockfish rod, the tip is typically thicker diameter, so they're stiffer tips intentionally, and the reason for that is that from a Japanese point of view, they're basically bouncing the soft plastic lures back through the rocks and the gullies, just like we do with our wrasse, and they want that bottom contact. So although it's a very different rod to the likes of the breamer that we just spoke about, it's kind of doing the same thing but in a different way, in that you just have that stiffness in the tip, or that the breamer does it with a solid tip. Just because it's solid, it's kind of giving you that feeling. With a stiffer hollow tip, you get that same sort of thing. So in contrast, you can imagine trying to bounce something back through the rocks or the gullies or whatever with a very, very soft tip. You're not getting that feeling bouncing into the rod. So a stiffer tip can be a great thing for either bigger top waters, if you want to work them at distance anyway, and it just makes everything easy on your wrist, and it makes life very simple, especially if the rod itself is very lightweight. On these Japanese rockfish rods, you tend to get a slightly shorter grip as well, because of the fact that they're designed for twitching soft plastics at closer range. So they're not one necessarily designed for absolute distance, although they cast incredibly well. They are designed for bottom contact above all else. It just happens coincidentally that they're great for other things. On paper, they're not ever going to be the fastest action rods, because you're starting from a thicker point up here. So you'll have not a regular action. I mean, you could almost describe them as that in some cases though, but they're basically just not extra fast or anything like that. They're probably not even fast on paper, but they've got that stiffness and that steeliness that some people are really going to like for certain situations. They're going to fish every lure, but I think it's with the top waters, and especially with the heavier lures, they're going to come into their own a little bit. Then we've got, to sort of bypass the typical bass rods again, because they're sort of in the middle of this lot, we have things like the Apia range and the Art Magic that we built. This actually, I should be honest, this actually is a prototype of a slightly lighter action rod. So, but it's the same sort of concept, just generalized bass rods on the whole. And you get some bass rods, which I really like, hence us creating the Art Magic the way that we have, where you have this slightly lighter tip. They're not soft and light throughout. I mean, they do eventually taper in quite nicely and cleverly into a certain amount of power once you get to sort of a third of the way down the rod really. But by having this lighter tip, the benefit of that is, A, with lighter lures, and it kind of, for me, it brings everything together in a certain way. I'm not somebody that fishes lots of big surface lures, so I don't use personally quite that often a very stiff tipped rod. But the benefit of a lighter tip, if you're going to find a rod with that sort of style, is that it means that casting lighter lures initially is just better and easier. And the thing with the Art Magic, just to talk about that specifically, is that it gives me the benefit in that I can fish light lures thanks to the fact that the tip section will bend, and it obviously will compress when you're casting, but then it also combines that with lots of power down here. So you've got the benefits of a light rod for our bass fishing, sea bass fishing, obviously, if you're watching this from elsewhere. But you can also fish light and land big fish, which is, for me, it's kind of the ideal, because there is always a risk, I think, with the way that it's going at the moment, because a lot of fishing these lighter, shorter rods is relatively new to a lot of our sea bass anglers. there's a risk that we can go too light, because if we find ourselves along the edges of estuaries and things like that, trying to haul decent fish out of weed beds, then some of these rods that we're talking about, especially the likes of the bream rods, not necessarily the breamers because they've got a lot of power compared to some, but there's other chinyu rods they call them, where the ratings are great. You're looking at sort of 15, 18, 20 gram ratings, but the rods are so physically light that I think there's a risk always that you could possibly break something. So I think always I'd suggest being sensible, obviously. I don't want anybody to break a rod because it's a horrible situation sometimes. Spares are available or aren't available. We never quite know, even as the middlemen. So it's nice not to break rods, but having the rod, and it's the case with buying rods generally, tip action aside, there's always contradictions, and a lot of it is down to your personal preferences. I think it's just my job to explain some of the differences sometimes. So lighter action bass rods, you've got that benefit. Lighter lures, more control and feel over lighter lures, because you're, especially when you're retrieving and not necessarily twitching loads, or being aggressive with it anyway, you've got, because the tip will bend slightly with a softer action tip into a lighter lure as you're retrieving, you're kind of creating tension as the line comes back through the tip guide and up your initial guides, where the rod is bent around a little bit, which means that you're kind of feeling that contact just through the reel as you're retrieving. Whereas if you have a very stiff tip, in contrast, you're winding, but the rod isn't really bending into it to create that extra little bit of friction as it curves round. So you're trying to retrieve a lure, but not really feeling where it is. So you can be a bit aimless unless you have a little bit of lightness in the tip sometimes. And it depends on the style of lure you're using, obviously. There's some, well, like I say, big top water lures, you might not need that tension that you need to feel. Light soft plastics, you absolutely would. So having a rod to do everything and actually have it be a 10 out of 10 on everything is literally impossible. So as much as you see a trillion product descriptions for rods, especially, where it'll just say, this rod fishes everything in the world, it's never true. I mean, it's never going to be 10 out of 10 on everything. So I only ever want to be honest with our customers, and I only want them to have rods they're going to enjoy using, which is why, like I said at the start, I'll always kind of give you a choice in a way if I can, because although there might be something that I just know suits what you want to do, more often than not, the chances are we're going to have some options for you, and it doesn't matter to me which one you buy. I just want you to buy the one that is right for you. So we have tips. We have, obviously, I tend to split rods into three parts. So we have tip, middle, and butt. So it's from the tips, which is obviously what we've spoken about. It goes all the way from light to stiff, obviously. The middle is an interesting section where obviously power can kick in or not, and it's relevant in terms of action, because action is something that you'd compare with regards to slow, regular, fast, etc. But there's a little bit more to it in that the taper doesn't necessarily, or that action doesn't always tell you everything about a rod, because you could, for example, and we see it more on the LRF rods, which we'll talk about later, but you could have technically a very fast action rod, which comes out quite quickly. So on paper, it's very fast, but then actually is relatively slowly tapered through the middle of the rod, which means that actually it can be technically very fast, but also quite parabolic. So it can get complicated. And I don't mean for that video to do this, but with regards to buying bass rods, which is a lot of what we're doing, wrasse, you can relate to this as well, because you want this bottom contact with wrasse fishing. We're looking at lightness for lighter lures and straight retrieves as well, and stiffness for more jerky actions. So it's up to you to settle where you want to. The middle, like I said, can be either a bit here or there. There's different types of joints. I mean, some of the Appia rods we're working with now, they have put-in joints, which means you go from a slightly finer tip into a more powerful butt quite quickly. Blended really nicely because they're Appia. They've done it so well, you don't notice that break. But it means you get the lightness with the power, and that's the feature I'd say elsewhere as well. But with the Appia rods, you get that versatility where you can kind of fish light and heavy all at once. So they're quite magical with what they do. You do get that elsewhere as well, but it's specifically with the Appias at the moment. With the butt, that obviously then gives you the real power, because regardless of how light the tip is, if you're going to be casting a lure, it's really the power that's coming in from the butt that's actually what's really punching the lure. As you'll know, I mean, when you're projecting a lure, it's this last little bit when you're basically creating that kind of fulcrum in a way or the pivot to actually propel the lure, and it's the butt that's going to decide the overall power. So sometimes manufacturers will be great in that they'll give you butt diameters. It's a bit random, to be honest, though, because even the likes of Appia that I mentioned, the way that they measure it, I think, is actually on top of the whipping, so it's different to how I would measure the blank, which is why in the past we've even just done some of our own measurements to kind of try and figure out the tapers of these things. But it's with that butt that obviously your power comes in. It's how it's spread through the rod that varies from rod to rod, even between different brands and the way that they build their rods. But hopefully that's explained some of it. I know it's difficult sort of to try and cut down because it is quite complex. Okay, just to summarise a little bit, what types of rods perhaps we would use for certain situations, what I would use anyway. Like I say, people will have their own ideas, but what I use for my bass fishing, for example, because that's the topic of this one. So our bass fishing in the UK and down here in Cornwall is very varied. So we'll fish anything from estuaries and tiny little creeks all the way out to the very open coast and massive waves and big seas. So there's a huge variety of rods that you could well own if you get carried away. I'm in a fairly lucky situation, obviously I get to fish with a lot, but as a general person, which I know most people are very normal people, they will want to own as fewer rods as they can possibly get away with. And there's certain rods that I can suggest that obviously can help with that, or certain styles of rods. It'll be up to you a little bit to maybe ask some questions or do some research to try and figure out exactly what you like. But I think with my own fishing, just to give an example, I mean, to start off with, like I said, perhaps the latest trend in a way in the UK would all be all the creature baits that we're fishing in our estuaries now, whether they're crabs or whether they're sort of crayfish type things, little lobsters, etc. It's the type of rod that deserves something like a rockfish rod or a bream rod. You have to be a little bit careful with the bream rods, in both actually. They're good examples of one little point I meant to make, and that's to do with the casting weights that we see on rods. Because Japanese sea bass rods, you typically are going to get some consistency, so you can roughly buy what they are. On the whole, with most of the brands, if it says, let's say it's a rod that's rated to 30 grams maximum, most of them, unfortunately, will probably realistically only chuck mid-20s. So as soon as you put a bulky topwater on, for example, on a 30-gram rod, all of a sudden they're feeling a little bit spongy. So you've got to be a bit careful with the ratings. Most often, assume they probably won't quite handle what they say they will, or if they do have a rating that's accurate, it's going to be probably that they've been cast with a metal lure, which can be very dense, very streamlined, and will go to the maximum of the rod's rating. With any big soft plastics or plugs, you've got to be really careful because you're not going to be able to chuck as many grams as they say. So that's bass rods though, it's a bit more simple with them. You've then got your bream rods, the Chinyu rods, where on the whole they're actually pretty accurate, but again I'd say that their top ratings are more to do with maybe little metal jigs and stuff like that rather than plugs, etc. So trying to chuck a 15-gram plug on a 15-gram rated bream rod isn't going to work very well. So aside from the fact that the tips might be lighter than you'd want, it's just not going to handle it. Rockfish rods are the really complex one, and that's kind of a topic in its own right in a way, but they are a rod where you've got to be really careful because you might find that most rockfish rods, not all, and luckily the Tyros are quite accurate, but a lot of rockfish rods, it's like they had a totally different way of rating them. So regardless of action in a way, they're all going to have relatively stiff tips. That is the design of a Japanese rockfish rod, but you're going to find that a 20-gram rated rockfish rod, to compare it to a sea bass rod, it might feel like it can chuck 40. They can be so stiff and so powerful. So look at the PE ratings on rods, just as a little bit of a side project, because that can sometimes tell you perhaps what the true power of a rod is. But I think for our estuaries, like I say, bream rods and rockfish rods, anything rated to sort of like 20 grams, 25 grams, like I say, I think there's a concern I have about people going too light considering the size of some of the fish we catch in our estuaries, but a 25-gram rockfish rod is going to be lovely, just as an average. Sea bass rods, I mean, once we get out into the open coast a bit more, where we might want a bit more distance, the sea bass rods from Japan are typically designed more with plugs in mind, to be honest. So although we fish lots and lots of soft plastics on them, and it does it really well, it's with the plugs in mind that they're more often designed. The weird thing is that then it's almost like they're rated for metals. So again, be dubious of the upper ratings in most cases, apart from Appia, which I don't mean to keep mentioning, but they are the one brand realistically that I know to be very accurate. If it says 35 grams on an Appia, it will cast 35 grams. But the rest of them, and it's no bad thing as long as you know, take that maximum rating with a little bit of a pinch of salt and just don't go that heavy, especially if you've got a big shadow or something on, because it will just max the rod out. So open coast, I'll be looking at the sea bass rods at this point, 8'6", 9 foot for general fishing. 9 foot is probably the UK average, I think, really, which is why we made the Art Magic at 9 foot, because it will just do everything, go everywhere, just easy to use. So that's really that benchmark, I think, in the middle. Outside of that, then you're looking perhaps at slower action rods, actually. I mean, once you need distance, that's when you can start to look more so at the regular action rods and things like that, because you don't need or want actually very fast taper, because you want a rod to actually bend, because the point when you're doing that sort of fishing is you want to cast above all everything else. You're not being all dainty and twitchy with a tiny little lure when the surf's raging. So having a rod that's designed to cast and be more parabolic is actually a really good thing. As long as it's not soft and floppy, all it's got to do is bend on the cast but then recover really quick, and that'll just give you maximum distance. So those are the three types of rods that I probably end up using mostly. I'd say 9 foot, 8'6" bass rod is going to suit most people. Look for something rated to perhaps 30, 35 grams as your average all-rounder, and you won't go too far wrong. But like I say, give us a call, send us an email, leave a comment, do whatever you like. I've talked far too long, so thank you very much for watching.